We're joined now on AGUTV by Professor Paul Williams, who's a Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Reading. So Paul, you've been doing a lot of really interesting research into the use of music. I wonder if you can tell us really how the music can be used to communicate aspects of geosciences.
Well, one of the limitations of science that I've become aware of recently is that it doesn't engage people emotionally, it doesn't move people. And that was an interesting realization for me because as a scientist, science is meant to be a description of nature. Nature does move people, clearly, so why doesn't science move people? And I've been thinking about that, and it seems to be that the explanation is that there's a level of abstraction required to do science, objectivity, that kind of strips away the possibility of any emotional connection. So I think there's a growing number of people, scientists, who are realizing that in order to re-establish a connection between the science that we do and people's values and emotions, we need to start to use the arts more as an ally, and for me in particular that means music.
And how do you find that classic and popular music can be used to maybe tell us a little bit about past weather events?
Let me give you an example. We know that in the United States, in the 1950s and 1960s, that was a two-decade period with lots of severe weather. Lots of hurricanes, for example, more named hurricanes than the next 2 decades, the 70s and 80s. Now what we found by analysing a database of karaoke lyrics of songs going back to the 1950s is that there are more mentions of bad weather, hurricanes, storms, wind, rain in songs that were written in the 1950s and 60s than in the 70s and 80s. So it does seem to be that the record of popular music, songs that have been written over the decades, is kind of a record of the weather that people were experiencing at the time when the song was written.
So maybe speaking specifically about glacial science, how do you think that music can be used to communicate glacial geoscience to a range of different audiences?
And that's a very slow process. Glacial things tend to take decades, centuries, millennia. Actually, we have looked at classical music as well, going back centuries to the 15th century, and we find interesting things there too. We have evidence that composers were representing the kind of weather phenomena that were in the country that they were living in when they wrote the composition. So, for example, thinking about representations of the Northern Lights in classical music, there are representations of the Northern Lights from composers who were living in Scandinavian countries, written preferentially in years when the Northern Lights were very strong. So there's an evidence there that classical music is kind of recording the history of the climate and the weather.
Thanks, Paul. And final question for you. Why do you think it's important that we have to, or that we should engage a variety of different audiences with science?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for me, climate change is the answer to that. It's a classic example where we have all the facts and figures, we know all of the numbers, we know that the climate's changing, we know that humans are the dominant cause of that changing, we know how sensitive the climate is to carbon dioxide within some error bars. So we have the equations, the calculations, the facts and figures, and yet people's behaviour is not really being modified to the extent that we would need to see it modified to avoid the worst of dangerous climate change. So it's a great example of this post-factual world that we live in, where the facts and the figures aren't enough anymore. And I really think there's a lot of potential in the arts in general, but music in particular, to kind of engage people much more meaningfully about climate and climate change than the equations and the numbers and the charts do.
Thanks, Paul, for that chat. That was very, very enlightening.
My pleasure.
Professor Paul Williams, Professor in Atmospheric Science at the University of Reading, talking to us today on AGU TV.